The debris field was still warm. Fleet Commander Orville pressed one tendril against the outer hull of the observation deck and felt the vibration through the membrane, a low, irregular tremor that should not have existed in open vacuum. Nothing in this sector should have been generating heat signatures. Nothing in this sector should have been generating anything. The Keth Dominion's long-range surveys had classified this system as marginal, resource-poor, strategically negligible. And yet, the tremor moved through the hull again, rhythmic this time, like something breathing on the other side of metal. Orville pulled up the sensor feed and stared at the return data for 11 seconds before he accepted that the instruments were not malfunctioning. The debris field stretched across 4 light-minutes of space, hundreds of thousands of individual fragments, ranging from dust-sized particulate to pieces the size of small moons. The spectral analysis was already complete. The materials were consistent with Keth construction alloys. Every piece of wreckage in that field had, at some point, been a Keth warship. "Get me cartographer, yes," he said quietly, "and tell her to bring the historical records." What Yes brought him rewrote everything he thought he understood about the last 400 years. The Keth Dominion's Central Archives listed the Third Expansion Fleet as lost in transit navigational anomaly, 14,000 ships, gone. The official record was tidy, bureaucratic, the kind of notation that closes a question without answering it. Orville had read that entry as a junior strategist and accepted it without curiosity. Navigational anomalies happened. Space was large. Ships were sometimes lost. He had not asked where they went. He had not asked because the answer was 4 light-minutes of superheated wreckage, orbiting a small blue planet that the Dominion's taxonomy listed as uninhabited pre-spaceflight Class 4 biosphere. "The age of the debris," he said. "Tell me the age again." Yes kept her voice carefully neutral. "The oldest fragments date to approximately 387 years ago. The most recent fragments," she paused, and in that pause Orville felt the first cold edge of something he could not yet name, "are 11 months old." He turned from the viewport. 11 months. "Yes, Commander. 11 months ago, something in this system destroyed a Keth vessel." "Several," she said. "Based on fragment distribution, I estimate between 40 and 60 ships. Recent impact signatures, high-temperature dissolution events consistent with—" She stopped herself. Started again more carefully. "Consistent with weapons fire." The planet turned slowly below them, wrapped in white cloud, utterly serene. 3 mysteries had now crystallized in Orville's mind, and not one of them had an answer he was willing to accept at face value. First, who or what had destroyed 14,000 Keth warships 4 centuries ago and left no record, no claim, no warning? Second, what had been attacking Keth vessels as recently as 11 months ago, long after the Dominion believed this system abandoned? Third, and most disturbing, why had the Dominion's own records classified this as a navigational anomaly rather than a military engagement? Someone had buried this. He pressed his tendril to the viewport and looked at the planet again. "Prepare a scout package," he said. "Passive sensors only. I want atmospheric readings, surface activity scans, electromagnetic spectrum analysis." He paused. "And I want a complete cross-reference of every Dominion vessel ever assigned to this sector." "That could take—" "I know how long it will take, yes. Do it anyway." The planet turned. It did not look dangerous. That was perhaps the most unsettling thing about it. It looked quiet and soft and very, very old. The scout data came back in fragments over the next 18 hours, and with each fragment the picture grew stranger, not clearer. The electromagnetic analysis alone was enough to reclassify the planet from Class 4 to something the Dominion's taxonomy had no existing category for. The surface was blanketed in an astonishing density of coordinated signal traffic, structured, layered, operating across dozens of frequency bands simultaneously. The civilization below was not pre-spaceflight. It was, if the sensors were reading correctly, operating in space right now. The orbital shell around the planet was crowded with structures, satellites, vehicles, platforms, all moving in extraordinarily precise choreography. They were watching it happen in real time, and the beings on those orbital platforms had apparently not yet detected the Keth observation fleet. Or they had detected it and chosen not to react. That second possibility sat in Orville's chest like something cold and heavy. "Pull the biological data," he said to his science officer, Thren. "What are these creatures?" Thren's color shifted slightly, the Keth equivalent of discomfort. Bilaterally symmetrical, soft-bodied, warm-blooded by our classification. Upright locomotion, 2 primary limbs used for manipulation, 2 for movement. Average body temperature significantly elevated compared to most spacefaring species. Another color shift, remarkably fragile by structural analysis. No external armoring. Organs exposed beneath a thin layer of biological tissue. Bone structure that would fracture under loads a Keth child could generate. "They look," Orville said slowly, "like they should not have survived long enough to build all of that." He gestured at the orbital shell. "They look," Thren agreed carefully, "like prey animals who decided not to behave like prey animals." Neither of them spoke for a moment. "And these are the creatures," Orville said, "who destroyed 14,000 of our warships." "We don't know that with certainty, Commander. We only know the ships are gone and the debris is here. Pull up any record of prior contact between the Dominion and this species. Anything. Diplomatic, commercial, military, exploratory." Thren worked in silence for 30 seconds. "There are no formal contact records. There are 3 internal memos in the Admiralty archives from approximately 400 years ago. They are classified at the highest security tier." "Decrypt them." "I don't have authorization." "Thren," Orville's voice was very quiet, "we are sitting in a debris field made of our own warships, orbiting a planet that someone in the Admiralty decided the rest of the Dominion did not need to know about. Decrypt them." The silence that followed lasted exactly long enough to constitute a decision. "Decrypting," Thren said. The first memo was brief. A single page, dated 4 months before the 3rd expansion fleet had been dispatched. It named this system, gave it its proper designation, which was not the generic catalog number in current records but a specific, individualized notation that implied someone had studied it closely. The memo recommended against military engagement and offered a single sentence of justification. "These creatures do not respond to force in any way we have models for." The second memo was longer. It was a post-engagement report from the only surviving officer of a prior scout mission, a mission that had preceded the 3rd expansion fleet by 6 years, that had never appeared in any public record, that had sent 12 vessels into this system and received back 1, badly damaged, carrying a commander who had resigned from service within 3 days of returning and never spoken publicly about what happened. Orville read the report twice. He read it a 3rd time slowly, looking for the part where it would begin to make sense. The scout fleet had made contact. The creatures, the humans, as they called themselves in their own dense and proliferating language, had responded to initial Keth communication attempts with something the surviving commander described, in phrasing that revealed his own bafflement, as *escalating negotiation despite clearly inferior military position. They had been outgunned. They had known they were outgunned. The Keth sensors had detected the primitive state of their weaponry within minutes of arrival. And the humans had still refused to concede anything. When Keth forces had demonstrated their firepower, a standard intimidation display designed to trigger immediate capitulation in any rational species, the humans had responded by firing back. Not because they thought they could win. The commander's report was clear on this point, because it was the point he seemed least able to explain. They had fired back despite knowing they would lose. when two Keth vessels were destroyed in what the commander initially dismissed as a lucky counterattack. The remaining Keth forces had increased their firepower to overwhelming levels. The humans had continued firing. When we destroyed their military vessels, the report read, they sent civilian vessels. When we destroyed civilian vessels, they sent individual humans in primitive life support suits. When we destroyed those, we detected further launches from the surface. We eventually calculated that at the rate they were deploying assets, they would exhaust their entire orbital capacity within 11 days. We waited for them to exhaust it. A long gap in the text here, as though the commander had stopped writing and then resumed with some difficulty. They did not stop. Orville looked up from the document. They never stopped, he said. It wasn't a question. Thren, who had been reading alongside him, said nothing. The third memo was the one that changed everything. It was the shortest of the three, barely a paragraph. It was authored not by a field commander, but by someone in the Admiralty's Office of Strategic Projection, and it was dated 2 weeks before the third expansion fleet was dispatched. It read, "We have reviewed the scout report and find the behavioral anomalies described therein to be consistent with a species experiencing temporary psychological dysregulation due to contact shock. The irrational behavior observed will normalize as the creatures process the reality of their strategic position. The third expansion fleet will complete territorial acquisition within 90 days of arrival." 90 days. The third expansion fleet had arrived and had not come back. They thought the humans were panicking, Orville said. The cold thing in his chest had grown considerably heavier. They looked at a species that refused to stop fighting when it should have stopped, and they decided those creatures were simply confused, irrational, too frightened to behave logically. That appears to have been the Admiralty's conclusion, Thren said quietly. They sent 14,000 warships to correct the confusion. The planet turned below them, unhurried patient wrapped in white. What happened to the third expansion fleet, Thren? Not what the archives say, what actually happened. I don't know, Commander, the debris suggests. Not the debris. The debris tells us they were destroyed. I want to know how. 14,000 warships. We have nothing in our records of any species destroying 14,000 Keth warships. Nothing. Not the Vorin Collective, not the Shal Imperium, not any of the great powers. How did a soft-bodied species on a single planet with no confirmed FTL capability 11 months ago, he stopped himself, controlled his voice. Begin full sensor analysis of the planet's surface and orbital infrastructure. I want to know what they've built. I want to know what they're building right now. Already running, Thren said. Commander, she hesitated. Say it. The orbital shell is larger than I initially reported. I was reading the inner layer. There's a second layer. And her color shifted to something Orville had never seen from her before, a deep violet that in Keth emotional language corresponded approximately to witnessing something that violated the observer's fundamental model of reality. There's a third. 3 orbital shells. 3 distinct layers of constructed infrastructure, operating in coordinated silence around a planet whose dominant species should not, by any metric in the Dominion's database, have progressed beyond basic atmospheric flight by now. Orville spent 6 hours reviewing the sensor data personally. He did not trust the summary. He wanted every layer, every reading, every thermal signature, every power output measurement. He wanted to hold the complexity of what was below him in his own mind and see if it would resolve into something comprehensible. It did not. But in those 6 hours, surrounded by data that refused to add up, he found the thing that changed everything he thought he understood about the debris field, the missing fleet, and what the humans actually were. The third orbital shell wasn't defense infrastructure. It was archives. Vast, precisely maintained data repositories orbiting at a distance that would keep them intact even if the inner 2 shells were completely destroyed. Hundreds of stations, all facing outward, not toward the planet but toward open space, transmitting constantly on frequencies the Keth had classified as background noise for centuries. They were not transmitting to anyone inside the system. They were transmitting records outward, into the galaxy, in a format designed to survive even if everything below was gone. Orville stared at that data for a long time. They built their library outside their own defenses, he said, not to Thren exactly, more to himself, more to the part of himself that was beginning to understand something enormous and terrible about the nature of the species below. They built it so that even if they were destroyed, even if everything was destroyed, the record would survive. He turned away from the sensor feed. They've been preparing for the possibility of their own extinction since before we arrived. That's not, Thren stopped. Rational, he looked at her. It is not rational for a species to prepare its own epitaph as a strategic asset. You're correct. No rational species does that. He looked back at the viewport. But that is what they did. And now ask yourself what else they might have done that we have been categorizing as irrational. The first misinterpretation was already correcting itself in his mind. The Admiralty had looked at humans fighting against impossible odds and seen panic, confusion, temporary dysregulation. They had been wrong. What they had seen, what Orville was now beginning to understand, was not panic. It was planning. It was the behavior of a species that had looked at the universe, concluded that the universe would eventually try to kill them, and decided the only available response was to become more expensive to kill than any potential attacker could afford. Not stronger, more expensive. There was a difference, a profound and deeply unsettling difference. What are they building in the second shell? He asked. Thren looked at her instruments. I'm having difficulty categorizing it. The power signatures they're larger than anything I have a reference class for. The structural configurations. She went quiet for a long moment. Commander, I think I need to show you the construction timeline projections. She transferred the data to his display. Orville looked at the projected completion dates for the structures currently under construction in the human orbital shell. Then he looked at the scale of what was being built. Then he looked at the direction. The largest of the new structures was oriented. It was oriented toward Keth space. Not toward the debris field. Not defensively inward. Toward Keth space, toward the heart of the Dominion, toward the 600 inhabited systems that made up the largest civilization in the known galaxy. How long, he said, and his voice came out very quiet, have they been building in that direction? The construction timestamps. Thren's color cycled through several shades rapidly. The timestamps suggest they began reorienting the outer shell construction approximately 380 years ago. 380 years ago. 11 years after the third expansion fleet never came back. They had been preparing this response for 380 years, in silence, without announcing it, without sending diplomats or ultimatums or declarations. While the Dominion filed its paperwork and reclassified the system as navigational loss and moved on to other business, the humans had spent nearly 4 centuries quietly building something pointed at the heart of the empire that had tried to take their world. I need to reach the Admiralty, Orville said. Open a channel. Encrypted. Encrypted. And Thren, he paused with his hand on the communication panel, put the fleet on silent running. No active sensors, no transmissions except the command channel, nothing that would let them detect us more precisely than they already have. You think they already know we're here? It was not a question. I think, Orville said carefully, that we are dealing with a species that has been expecting us for 380 years. I think they have had significantly more time to prepare for this conversation than we have. The encrypted channel to the Admiralty took 4 hours to establish at this distance. In those 4 hours, Orville did 3 things. He reviewed every piece of sensor data from the human system a second time. He composed his report. and he sat for a long time in silence, looking at the debris field, trying to count the ships. He couldn't. There were too many fragments, too many pieces. But the heat signature data, when combined with the spectrographic analysis, gave him an estimated count. Around 14,000 vessel origin points, consistent with the size of the third expansion fleet. What was not consistent with anything was the pattern of the destruction. The oldest fragments showed what you would expect from a military engagement: high-energy impacts, explosive decompressions, structural failures consistent with weapons fire. The outer field was classical battle debris. The inner field was different. The inner field was wrong. The ships that had died in the inner field had not been destroyed by weapons fire. The spectral analysis on those fragments, the ones closest to the planet, showed something else entirely. Orville had initially dismissed it as instrument error or contamination from the outer debris field. But looking at it again, without the assumption of battle, the data was clear. The innermost vessels of the third expansion fleet had been systematically disabled, stripped, and disassembled. Not destroyed, disassembled. Something had taken apart Keth warships in open space, piece by piece, and the materials had been. He cross-referenced the data with the orbital shell construction readings. The materials had been used. The alloys matched. Keth construction metals, woven into human infrastructure. 14,000 warships, partially recycled into the scaffolding of a civilization preparing itself for the next inevitable encounter. Orville sat with that knowledge for a long time. They had not just defeated the fleet, they had used it. They had looked at 14,000 warships and seen raw materials. The message that sent was not anger, not triumph. It was something colder and more considered than either of those things. It was efficiency. It was the behavior of a species that did not waste. When the channel to the Admiralty finally opened, the voice that greeted him was brisk, bureaucratic, already impatient. Fleet Commander Orville, your position puts you well outside your assigned patrol zone. Explain. I'm in the debris field of the third expansion fleet, Orville said. I have discovered that the official record of the fleet's loss is false. They were not lost to a navigational anomaly. They were destroyed by the native species of the system below me, and the Admiralty has known this for nearly 4 centuries and concealed it. Silence on the channel. Then, that is an extraordinary claim. I have the decrypted memos. I have the sensor data. I have the construction timeline. I have proof that this species has been building an offensive infrastructure oriented toward Keth space for 380 years. He kept his voice level with effort. I also have to inform you that I believe they are aware of our presence. I am recommending an immediate strategic withdrawal of all Keth assets within 6 light years of this system, and I am formally requesting that the Admiralty authorize diplomatic contact before. Fleet Commander, the voice on the other end had changed, harder now. Your fleet assets are being redirected to your position under the authority of Strategic Projection Order 7. You are to hold position and await reinforcement. The creatures in that system represent an unresolved territorial matter. Their behavior constitutes. How many ships? Orville interrupted. Another pause. Excuse me. How many ships are being sent? That is not information you require for your current. I require it, Orville said, because whoever is making this decision needs to understand that the species below me built their current infrastructure by recycling the 14,000 ships you're proposing to send more of. And I would like to know if we have given any thought to what they will build with the next batch. The channel went quiet for a full minute. Orville looked at the planet. Something was moving in the second orbital shell. Not dramatically, not aggressively. A slow repositioning, the kind of motion that a non-suspicious observer might categorize as routine maintenance or orbital adjustment. But it was oriented toward his fleet. Subtly, incrementally, With the patience of a species that had been practicing this kind of patience for centuries, the second shell was turning to face them. They had known from the beginning. "Thren," he said quietly, "how many of our ships are currently in weapons range of those second shell structures?" She checked. The color that moved through her skin was the deepest violet he had ever seen. "All of them," she said. What happened in the next 40 minutes happened too quickly for any single mind to hold completely. The Admiralty's reinforcements arrived, not the size Orville had feared, but still substantial, another 8,000 warships dropping from FTL at the edge of the system, their approach vectors textbook precise, their formations designed for maximum intimidation. A show of force, an object lesson in scale, a message that the Dominion intended to be legible without translation. The message the humans sent back was also legible without translation. Nothing moved in the human orbital shells. No weapons fire, no obvious defensive activation, nothing that any Keth strategic officer looking at a tactical display would classify as a response. Instead, every single structure in the third orbital shell, the archive stations, the records repositories, the data transmitters that had been broadcasting outward into the galaxy for centuries, went silent simultaneously. They stopped transmitting. In the span of 30 seconds, every archive in the outer shell shut down and went dark. Orville did not understand this immediately. It was Thren who understood it first, and the sound she made, a soft, involuntary exhalation in the middle of silence, was the most frightened sound he had ever heard from another Keth. "They're not going to broadcast anymore," she said. "They're done broadcasting." And then, because he still wasn't following, she said, "Commander, why would they stop broadcasting the records? Why would they go dark the moment our reinforcements arrived?" The answer came to him slowly, the way very large things always come, not as a flash but as a weight settling. They had been broadcasting their history outward for 380 years because they expected to be destroyed. The archive stations were insurance. The transmission was their contingency plan. If the humans died, at least the record would survive, scattered across the galaxy, preserved forever in formats designed to outlast any empire. They had just turned that contingency plan off. They had decided they no longer needed it. "They're not afraid," Orville said, not loudly, not with any particular emotion, simply stating a fact that had just become undeniable. "They looked at 8,000 more of our warships and they decided they don't need the insurance anymore." He opened the fleet-wide command channel. "All ships, this is Fleet Commander Orville. Reduce power to minimum operational levels. Do not activate weapon systems. Do not make any movement that could be interpreted as aggressive." He paused. "I'm going to attempt to establish a communication channel with the planet below. Any commander who fires before I have completed that attempt will answer to me personally." "Commander," someone said on the channel, one of the newly arrived squadron leaders, voice tight with the specific arrogance of someone who had just arrived and not yet read the data. "Our orders are to support territorial acquisition of." "Our orders," Orville said quietly, "were written by people who do not know what is in this debris field. I have read the debris field. I am asking for 30 minutes." He switched the channel before anyone could argue. The human communication frequencies were not difficult to find. They were everywhere, dense, layered, overlapping, a civilization talking to itself constantly across a dozen media simultaneously. Finding a frequency they monitored for external contact took longer, but Thren had been working on it for hours and she had an answer ready. Orville spoke into the silence. "This is Fleet Commander Orville of the Keth Dominion. I am transmitting from the debris field of the vessel fleet recorded in Keth archives as the third expansion. I am not transmitting to issue demands or threats." He stopped, thought about what he actually wanted to say, which was something the Dominion had no diplomatic language for. Then he said it in the plainest language he had. I came here to understand what happened. I have been here for 18 hours. I believe I now understand significantly more than I did when I arrived, and significantly less than I thought I did when I arrived this morning. Another pause. I would like to speak with someone who can help me close that gap. The response came 11 minutes later. Not on the frequency he'd used. On a different frequency, one his instruments confirmed had been broadcasting for the last 3 centuries, part of the archive transmission network, the one they just shut down. They turned that single station back on to reply to him. A voice, not translated through a machine. The translation was live, imperfect, with the particular quality of something interpreted by a mind rather than a program. A human voice, speaking in a cadence that carried the specific controlled calm of someone who was not surprised by this conversation at all. Fleet Commander Orville, we've been watching your fleet since it crossed the outer marker. We appreciate you asking for time before your colleagues made a decision that would have been difficult to walk back. A brief pause. In that pause, Orville heard something not in the voice but in the quality of the silence. We are prepared to talk. We want to be clear about one thing before we begin. Tell me, Orville said. We have been preparing for this conversation for 383 years. We have run this scenario approximately 40 million times. We are not telling you this to threaten you. We are telling you this so that you understand. Another pause. That we are very interested in a conversation that goes differently than the previous ones. The conversation lasted 61 hours. Orville did not sleep for any of them. He didn't think any of the humans did either. What emerged from those 61 hours was not a treaty, and not a surrender, and not a victory for any party. It was something the Dominion's diplomatic archives had no precedent for, because it required a foundational admission that no Keth Admiralty in 4 centuries had been willing to make. The humans laid out, in precise and patient detail, what had happened to the Third Expansion Fleet, not as a warning, not as a threat, as a historical briefing delivered by a species that had spent nearly 4 centuries categorizing and analyzing every aspect of the engagement because that was what they did. They studied every catastrophe and extracted from it every lesson it contained, and then they prepared. The Third Expansion Fleet had not been defeated in a single engagement. It had been defeated over 11 years, systematically. The humans had not possessed weapons capable of matching Keth firepower. They had never tried to match it. Instead, they had done something that the Keth strategic models had no category for. They had refused to fight the battle that the Keth were prepared to fight. Every time the fleet had moved to engage in direct combat, the humans had not been there. Every time the fleet had moved to secure resources, those resources had been moved. Every time the fleet had identified a human vulnerability and moved to exploit it, the vulnerability had stopped existing by the time they arrived. For 11 years, 14,000 warships had chased an enemy that kept declining to be where it was expected. The fleet had not been destroyed in any heroic last stand or brilliant tactical masterstroke. It had been taken apart, piece by piece, in 100 small engagements spread across 11 years, with the humans accepting losses that any rational military strategist would have classified as catastrophic, because they had a different relationship to the concept of acceptable loss than any species the Dominion had previously encountered. They had not been willing to die for victory. They had been willing to die to make the cost of conquest exceed the value of the conquest. There was a difference. It was not a small difference. You knew you couldn't win, Orville said, at some point deep in the second day of talks. It was not an accusation. It was genuine bewilderment. We knew we couldn't win quickly, the human on the other end said. Her name was something he was still struggling to reproduce accurately. She had been speaking for most of the 61 hours with the steady, unhurried authority of someone who had been waiting a very long time to have this particular conversation. Quickly wasn't something we needed. We needed the cost to go up. Every year the campaign extended, it cost your fleet more fuel, ammunition, maintenance, crew attrition. Every small engagement added to the balance. You were depleting faster than you were gaining. We just needed to make sure you kept going long enough to notice. They didn't notice, Orville said. The Admiralty. They sent the fleet, and when it didn't come back, they classified the whole thing as an anomaly and moved on. We know, and in those two words was the weight of 380 years. That's why we built the second shell. The second shell, which was still pointed at the heart of Keth space, containing structures whose scale and purpose Orville still did not entirely understand. He had asked about them twice, and both times the answer had been the same: patient, honest, and designed to make him sit with the knowledge rather than dismiss it. "What is the second shell for?" he asked again. "Insurance," she said, "in case the conversation went differently." He thought about that for a moment. You were prepared to use it. We are always prepared for the conversation to go differently. That's what 380 years of preparation means, Fleet Commander. It means we stopped hopping the universe would be reasonable and started making sure we could survive it either way. A pause. We would much rather it be this way. The cost of the previous encounters had been counted in ships, in crew, in material, and years. What Orville carried out of that room, out of those 61 hours, was harder to quantify. The Dominion would survive. The relationship between humanity and the Keth would be, from this point, something different than either party had expected it to be 3 days ago. Not warmth, exactly. Not alliance yet. Something more honest than either of those things. Mutual recognition of the fact that each represented, for the other, an entity that was more complicated than expected and less safe to ignore than hoped. The Admiralty would not like his report. The Admiralty had not liked the Scout Commander's report 400 years ago either, and that commander had resigned and gone silent, and 14,000 warships had gone into a system and not come back. Orville had no intention of going silent. He prepared the report for 7 hours after the talks concluded. He sent it with his full authorization codes attached, which meant it could not be reclassified or buried without a formal record of the decision to do so. He attached the decrypted memos. He attached the debris field analysis. He attached the construction timeline for the second shell, complete with the projection data, the targeting orientation, and the estimated completion date, which was 14 months away. The last thing he attached was something Thren had found during the sensor analysis and flagged as anomalous. A single, short transmission that had gone out from the archive stations approximately 3 hours before his fleet had arrived in the system. Before they had known the Keth were coming. 3 hours before detection. A burst transmission, not broadcast, targeted, sent to a precise set of coordinates deep in Keth space. He included the coordinates in the report, with the note that they corresponded to no registered Keth facility or installation. He did not know what was at those coordinates. He did not know how the humans had known his fleet would arrive 3 hours after that transmission was sent. He did not know, if he was being fully honest, how many other preparations were in place that he had not found in 18 hours of sensor analysis. He turned from the console and looked at the planet one final time. It was morning on the portion below him. The cloud systems were moving in the slow patterns that indicated weather, that great machinery of atmosphere that had nothing to do with war or strategy, the planet simply turning as it always had, warm and unhurried beneath its white wrappings. 383 years. They had been sitting here for 383 years, building, preparing, studying, running their scenarios, maintaining their archives, staying quiet while the Dominion filed its paperwork and forgot about them. A species that looked, by every biological measure, like something that should have been too fragile to survive the universe it found itself in. No armor, no natural weapons. Elevated body temperature, as though they were always slightly feverish, always burning a little hotter than the world around them. Short-lived, individually, compared to most spacefaring species, each one lasting, at most, a century before the heat burned out. But they kept coming. That was the thing. They kept building and preparing and refusing and recovering, individually brief and collectively inexhaustible, burning through generations like fuel and somehow always having more. The galaxy had never encountered anything quite like it, and had not known what to do with it, and had made the very human mistake of assuming that what it didn't understand must therefore be weak. Orville pressed one tendril against the viewport. The tremor in the hull was gone now. Whatever had been generating it was still. The debris field drifted in its patient orbit, cooling slowly over the centuries as space reclaimed its silence. There would be more ships from the Dominion eventually. There would be more conversations, more negotiations, more of the long and complicated business of two civilizations trying to find a way to exist in the same galaxy without destroying each other. There would be difficult moments. He was not naive enough to think otherwise. But he thought about those archive stations, and what it meant that they had been built at all. A species that had looked at the stars and concluded the stars were dangerous, and had responded by building a library at the edge of their own atmosphere so the record would survive even if they didn't. A species that treated its own potential extinction not as an end to be avoided at any cost, but as a logistical problem to be managed, a data preservation challenge, a project to be planned for and worked around. What kind of thing does that? What kind of thing builds its own memorial, and then uses the preparation to ensure the memorial stays empty? He thought about that for the rest of the transit home. He thought about it in the subsequent weeks while the Admiralty absorbed his report in furious, frightened silence. He thought about it when the diplomatic teams were assembled, and the first formal sessions were scheduled, and the long, slow work of something other than war began. He was still thinking about it years later, at a ceremony where the first joint station was completed at the edge of the debris field, when a human diplomat stood beside him and looked out at the fragments of 14,000 ships and said, in the careful cadence of someone choosing each word deliberately, "We didn't want this to happen." Orville believed her. He believed that the humans, individually and genuinely, had not wanted any of it. They had wanted to be left alone. They had wanted to build their libraries and their orbital shells and their archives and their preparations in peace. And every time someone had arrived in their system with the intention of taking something from them, they had simply become what the situation required. That was the thing no strategic model could account for. The Keth became what they were born to be. The Vorin Collective became what their biology shaped them toward. Every species in the Dominion's long catalog of civilizations was, more or less, what it had always been. Humans became what the situation required. They were not, at their resting state, the thing the Dominion had encountered. They were something else, something softer, something that built libraries and studied its own history and burned feverish and brief through individual lives that added up to something inexhaustible. But when the situation had required something else, they had become it without losing what they were underneath. You couldn't fight that, you couldn't plan for it, you couldn't model it. You could only, eventually, choose to stand beside it and hope it remained pointed somewhere else. The debris field turned slowly in the void behind them, cooling fragment by fragment, the long record of what happened when the galaxy decided something fragile should not exist and something fragile disagreed. The archive stations were transmitting again. The humans had turned them back on the day after the talks concluded, broadcasting outward into the dark in formats designed to survive anything. The record going out into the galaxy not as a memorial, not anymore, but as something else, something Orville had no word for in Keth, a concept that translated imperfectly into their language as testimony, or perhaps as the announcement of a species that had survived everything the universe sent and was still, stubbornly, impossibly, sending its story to the stars. Not because anyone was listening. Not because it would save them. Because that was what they did. Because they had decided at some point in the quiet centuries of their preparation that existing was not enough, that surviving was not enough, That to be the thing the universe could not quite manage to silence, that was worth building for, that was worth fighting for, that was worth all of it. The transmission washed over the Keth ships as they departed. It washed over the debris field, over the wreckage of every fleet that had tried and failed, over the new station rising at the edge of it all. It washed over the planet, still turning, still feverish, still burning. The Keth Dominion was the largest civilization in the known galaxy. It had 600 inhabited systems and a history stretching back further than most species' written records. It had never, in that entire history, encountered anything that scared it the way that transmission did. Not because of what it said, because of what it implied. They were not the strongest species in the galaxy. They had never been the strongest species in the galaxy. Every biological metric confirmed what the Dominion had always suspected. They should not have been here at all. But here they were, still transmitting, still building. And if you listened to the signal long enough, if you tracked it back to its origin, followed it to its source, found the moment it began and traced the thread of it forward through 380 years of silence and preparation and waiting, you found, at the very beginning, a single broadcast. Not a warning, not a declaration of war, not a plea for mercy or a demand for recognition. Just a statement. 6 words, repeated on a loop for nearly 4 centuries, broadcast outward into a universe that had tried more than once to end them. We are here, we remain.